present here. It is my extreme pleasure to invite you all and welcome you to the second lecture of Chinta Bar in this semester. As you all know, the Chinta Bar is a collective of students of IIT Madras engaged in economically, politically and socially relevant issues. Today we have with us Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and Professor Prabhat Patnaik needs no introduction, and he'll be speaking on imagination of an alternative world to mark the 100 years of October Revolution. I welcome you, sir, to IIT Madras campus. We also have with us Dr. Suresh Babu, who is a faculty in Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, who will be chairing the session. Welcome, sir. We also have with us the chairman of Asian College of Journalism. Sir, welcome. So now I'd like to invite Professor Prabhat Patnaik and Professor Suresh Babu to the dais.
Good evening. I thank the organizers for this very easy job for me to introduce Professor Prabhat Patnaik. As my friend mentioned earlier, he does not need an introduction, so I am not even attempting to introduce you. But I have a one-liner introduction. That is, he is India's most prolific macroeconomist, who straddles across various strands of economic theory, be it Keynesian or Kelleskian or the post-Keynesian, with ease. And I think that is reflected in the voluminous writing he has done on various aspects of the economy, generations of students he has produced, and students like me who have also benefited from his expertise. So I am not prolonging this introduction because you're all eagerly waiting to hear this lecture. But I'll just take a minute just to give the context for today's lecture, that is imagining an alternate world. Well, we are actually in a very difficult situation on an economic front globally. Yeah? The most recent World Economic Situation prospects released by the United Nations show that global economy remains trapped in a prolonged period of slow economic growth, dwindling international trade as well as growth. And the world gross output has expanded at an annual average rate of only 2.5%, much lower than 3.4% which was there prior to 2007-8. So this optimism that globally we have recovered and we are back on a growth track seems to be very, very a euphoric feeling, not the reality as far as the numbers are concerned. One. There is also this prolonged sluggishness in terms of global economy, which is widespread by a slowdown of productivity growth in many parts of the world, weak investments, including India. We have been waiting for private investments to grow, but it is not growing. Low wage growth, low inflation, rising debt levels, and low commodity prices. Now, I don't want to keep on saying low, 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 because most of the indicators seems to be at a very low level at the moment. But there is one problem that is really now coming up with this kind of a global weak economic outlook, and that is its impact on employment, wages, and household welfare. What we find is that at the global level, growth of household consumption has averaged at 2.2% per annum since 2012, compared to 3.3% a decade prior to the global economic crisis. There is also widespread global concern in terms of job security, vulnerability in employment, and minimal increases in both nominal as well as real wages, despite the fact that there is low levels of inflation across countries. Well, I think now the context is more or less clear. Now we have to really imagine an alternate world given this global economic situation. I don't want to stand in between a very fascinating lecture from Prabhat Patnaik. May I now request Prabhat Patnaik to deliver this lecture.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Also, I'm very grateful that I have been given this opportunity to come and address this meeting. The October Revolution indubitably was one of the most outstanding, if not the most significant event in human history, because it was an effort for people to really build an alternative world in which they would shape their own destiny. Now that the legacy of the October Revolution in the form of the Soviet Union is behind us, the Soviet Union has collapsed, there would naturally be a tendency to downplay the significance of the October Revolution. But I would like to suggest that there are at least three very obvious ways in which the October Revolution has left a historical legacy. One, and the most outstanding in a sense, is of course the defeat of fascism. But for the Soviet Union, fascism would not have been defeated. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point in the Second World War, and the enormous amount of sacrifice that the people made in the Soviet Union, Soviet people made 20 million dead, is precisely the price that had to be paid for the defeat of fascism. You compare, for instance, the Soviet people's response to fascism, their resilience, the capacity to stand up to it, the capacity to resist fascism with what you find, for instance, in France, and you see the kind of inspiration that the October Revolution had provided the Soviet people on the basis of which they could fight and defeat fascism. The second legacy, no less significant, is of course that decolonization, as we know, would not have been possible without the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill was totally opposed to Indian independence. And what is more true, that while immediately in the post-war conjuncture, imperialism had got weakened, had a few years passed, then you would have found imperialism reasserting itself to a point where decolonization might have been off the agenda. But it is not just the mere fact of political decolonization, but even more significant was the third world nations taking control of their own resources, the economic freedom that came with decolonization, which actually happened later, would simply not have been possible without the Soviet Union. Innumerable instances of it are there, including in India, where we know that the Seven Sisters, the oil companies, for instance, used to fleece this country until the Soviet Union came and stepped in with offer of assistance both in exploring oil and also in processing. And we know, for instance, that when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, there was an Anglo-French invasion of Egypt, which was immediately challenged by the Soviet Union, because of which it collapsed. So in country after country, Cuba would not have survived but for the support of the Soviet Union. Likewise, the Vietnam War would not have been won but for the support of the Soviet Union. So one can see that the whole process of decolonization was really made possible by the Soviet Union. And the third feature of it, which again tends to get understated, is that it actually built up for the first time an alternative economic system, which was marked by two features. One was that it was a system in which you did not have unemployment. On the contrary, as the Hungarian economist, who was quite anti-socialist, János Kornai, had argued that the entire socialist system, as opposed to the capitalist system, which is demand constrained, which therefore is faced with involuntary unemployment, the socialist system that was stepped up was necessarily characterized by, invariably, by a perennial labor shortage. Now, I think the modern period in mankind's history, it is unthinkable that you can actually have an economy in which there is no unemployment but labor shortage. And secondly, of course, it set up an economic system which produced the most gigantic welfare state in the world. The British National Health Service, which all of us admire so much, was inspired by the Soviet example. No greater welfare state system for the working people has ever been set up anywhere in the world. So we actually had an economic system which for the first time provided an alternative to capitalism, really created a system that was completely different from capitalism. I think these are very important historical legacies. But apart from the historical legacies, the October Revolution also had very important theoretical legacies. It, if I can borrow Regis Debre's term, it revolutionized the concept of revolution. Before the October Revolution, what Marx had written about, what Marx and Engels had written about, was basically about a proletarian revolution coming in Europe when capitalism has advanced sufficiently. To this, the theory preceding the October Revolution added a completely new dimension. And that dimension stated that in economies or in societies in which capitalism is developing late, in these societies, the bourgeoisie is in a position where it is not capable of dealing the blows against feudalism that the bourgeoisie had done, for instance, with the French Revolution. So the bourgeoisie coming late on the historical scene tends to compromise with feudalism and therefore tends to compromise on carrying forward the democratic revolution, which therefore can only be carried forward by the working class. And if the working class is carrying forward the democratic revolution through land redistribution, through smashing blows against feudalism, it doesn't just stop there, then it goes on to take this democratic revolution further forward towards socialism. So the idea that revolutions can occur even in third world underdeveloped countries, which can then lead on to socialism, was an idea that came with the October Revolution. Of course, the October Revolution was not talking about the third world, it was talking about Russia. The fact that in underdeveloped countries where capitalism has not developed, nonetheless the socialist revolution is on the historic agenda is something which was a contribution, a theoretical contribution of the October Revolution. With the war, an additional contribution came onto the scene, and that contribution was that not only was the socialist revolution through stages, through the formation of a worker-peasant alliance whose composition would keep changing over time, not only was it a possibility, but in fact it had come on the agenda. That imperialism, which was now characterized by intense rivalry, which had already partitioned the world, can now only repartitioning it by conducting wars in which workers in the advanced capitalist countries would actually be offered a choice. Either you kill fellow workers across the trenches, or you turn your guns against the capitalists who are pushing you to this front. Likewise, even the third world people were drawn into this war. We know that Qazi Nazrul Islam, for instance, the famous revolutionary poet, was one who actually fought in the First World War. Lots of Indian soldiers went and fought in the First World War. It widened their horizon, it gave them military training, and therefore it, as it were, dragged the consciousness of many in third world societies forward. And because of the fact that now imperialism had become a global phenomenon which was characterized by wars from time to time, the idea of overthrowing it at the weakest link, which would then go and spread elsewhere, which would have an impact elsewhere, came on the agenda, and it followed, therefore, that not only was a revolution in stages towards socialism possible in third world countries or on the broad historic agenda, but it had actually now come onto center stage. It had actually acquired a kind of imminence. Now, I think there were problems with the October Revolution arising, in a sense, from both these. One is that the idea that once you have broken the weakest link, the revolution would then spread, is an idea that did not work itself out, even though the Leninist picture of capitalism driven by inter-imperialist rivalries and driven also by wars that periodically break out was a remarkably accurate reading of the historical conjuncture between 1914 to 1945. You had then a period in which the First World War, the Great Depression, Second World War, all of which, in a sense, were products of inter-imperialist rivalry, and consequently Lenin's reading of it was absolutely accurate. Therefore, the Communist International's proposition that a general crisis of capitalism had arrived, and this general crisis was sustained, as it were, by the fact of inter-imperialist rivalry and wars, was an accurate reading of that historical conjuncture. In my view, that historical conjuncture changed after the Second World War. And I think we have to be clear about the nature of that change. And in a sense, the reason why capitalism, which had appeared on its deathbed, managed to survive and has managed to survive and flourish, is partly because that conjuncture had changed, and many of us on the left have not sufficiently recognized the change in that conjuncture. The second problem also arose, and I think this is related to the second innovation of the October Revolution, that the Worker-Peasant Alliance, through stages leading on to socialism. Now, of course, the management of the Worker-Peasant Alliance is something which is extremely difficult, and we know in the context of the Soviet Union, encircled as it was, the Worker-Peasant Alliance became difficult to sustain. To my mind, some of the vicissitudes in the fortunes of the Soviet Union, the fact that it led to a one-party dictatorship, the fact that it led to a depoliticization not only of the working class, but also of the Communist Party leadership, which is why when the Soviet Union collapsed, all the leaders in all the states that had constituted the Soviet Union, all the new presidents were the former Politburo members of the CPSU. Whether it is Nursultan Nazarbayev or Leonid Kravchuk or Edward Shevardnadze or Boris Yeltsin, they were all members of the Politburo of the CPSU, and they became presidents of the new republics, which actually suggests the depoliticization that had taken place in the leadership of the party itself, not just in the working class. And that in turn was because of the one-party dictatorship to which the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union did get converted into, and which in my view was a product of this twin phenomena. One, the revolution not spreading as had been expected to other countries, collapse of the German Revolution, and of course, collapse of other European revolutions, whether it is Hungary, Budapest Commune, or whether it is Munich Soviet, and so on, whether it is the Spartacist uprising in Germany. You actually had collapse of revolutions everywhere, so that the Soviet Union was more or less isolated, and at the same time, the difficulties of sustaining the Worker-Peasant Alliance. These were, in my view, the circumstances in which the Soviet Union found it increasingly difficult to live up to the promise of the kind of state that Lenin had visualized, a state that would actually no longer be a state of the old kind, a state that would wither away, that would in fact wither away from the morning of the revolution. There's a very interesting statement that Lenin had made before the revolution, that there's a collection brought out which discusses his writings of 1917. He says, if there's a revolution, then tomorrow we can put 20 million people to look after the state. Now, when you put 20 million people to look after the state, you're already talking about a state that is no longer a state. So that conception of a state that, as it were, dissolves increasingly into society, the state that withers away, became difficult to achieve, more and more difficult to achieve, and instead led to a one-party dictatorship, because the presumptions underlying the revolution were such that they could not be sustained. I come back to the question of the post-war conjuncture. Now, when I was a student, a book had come out, and it was a very influential book because there were articles by John Kenneth Galbraith, Shigeto Suru, just name all the kind of big names, Paul Sweezy and everybody, big names in liberal left social science circles. And the book was called Has Capitalism Changed? And of course, I think even though some argued no, but others, on the whole, the impression was that it had. There are certainly very important ways in which post-war capitalism differed from what Lenin had in mind. There are at least three ways in my mind in which post-war capitalism restructured itself. One, as I said, was decolonization. Many of these restructurings was in fact a response to the existence of the Soviet Union and the working class threat, but nonetheless it was a restructuring. One was decolonization. The other was the introduction of universal adult franchise as the basis of democracy. People don't often realize that when Marx wrote, when Lenin wrote, there was no universal adult franchise-based democracy. In Britain, when women got the vote in 1928 was the first time that you had, even then there were some residual property restrictions and so on, but broadly speaking, universal adult franchise, even the restricted, notwithstanding its restrictions, came into being in Britain in 1928. In France, it came into being in 1945. This was the country of the bourgeois revolution. This was the country where 1789 had happened. But nonetheless, in France, you had universal adult franchise and democracy based upon that only in 1945. And we should be glad that in India it happened in 1952. But the point is that this meant a substantial restructuring on the part of capitalism. My own feeling is that to some extent the bourgeoisie was willing to do this because of the fact that the bourgeois state had to a degree consolidated itself. If you look at the difference, if you look at the consolidation of the French bourgeois state as arising from the time of the defeat of the Paris Commune, 1871, between 1871 and 1945, you have a 74-year-old gap. If you look at the consolidation of the English bourgeois state as arising from roughly the middle of the 19th century, which historian Tom Nant calls the fateful meridian, then between the middle of the 19th century and 1928, you again have a period of about 75 years. So with the consolidation of the bourgeois state, the bourgeoisie itself was more willing, and of course it was forced by the emerging working class movement to make concessions in the direction of bourgeois democracy based on universal adult franchise. We must not forget that this was a period in which communists were virtually the most powerful political force in France and Italy. In Britain and in other European countries, social democracy was the most powerful force. Okay? So much so that Winston Churchill, the hero of the Second World War, lost the election after the war. The working class was not going to go back to the old days. It's very clear that capitalism had to restructure itself, otherwise it was going to be overthrown. So there was a very serious challenge to it. The third way that capitalism restructured itself is, of course, by providing, what economists would call state intervention in demand management, which actually meant a reduction in the unemployment rate, significant reduction in the unemployment rate. The Great Depression had pushed unemployment to huge levels. It was very clear. In fact, John Maynard Keynes, who was solidly anti-left, anti-socialist, a real kind of, bourgeois to the core, had actually said mankind is not going to tolerate for long the levels of unemployment that capitalism is now afflicted with. But on the other hand, the war, of course, meant that unemployment abated to an extent, naturally, because of war effort. But in the post-war period, if capitalism had gone back to those levels of unemployment, it would have found itself in an unsustainable position. Therefore, it had perforce to adopt certain kinds of measures under the social democratic governments that came up, which actually pushed employment to very high levels. I remember when I was a student in England, one of my, unemployment rate in England was less than 2%, which had never happened in the history of capitalism for such a long period of time. And I used to have a professor in Oxford, Lord Balog. Those of you who do development economics may remember him as Thomas Balog. So Thomas Balog used to say, he was a Jewish emigre from Central Europe, that if in Britain unemployment crosses 500,000, you will have fascification of this country. And as a result, the fact that capitalism could maintain such low levels of unemployment over such a long period suddenly made people think that the system had changed. And indeed, in many ways, it had changed. The low levels of unemployment in America were made possible by what some people call military Keynesianism. Baran and Sweezy talked about military expenditures being responsible for the high levels of employment in the US. But in Europe, high levels of employment were associated with welfare expenditures. Welfare expenditures financed to an extent through taxes on workers, but nonetheless not entirely, and therefore entailing net benefits as far as the working class is concerned. Now, what I want to say is that that gave the impression that really the socialist challenge was passing, that really from now on, capitalism has come to survive, that the word capitalism has changed, that the world now is going to see welfare capitalism. But with neoliberalism, I believe that a new phase of capitalism has come into being, whose climax, in a sense, is the period in which we are living. Now, this new phase of capitalism is one which is, of course, marked by the fact that there is complete freedom of capital, including finance, to move across borders of countries. There is also an associated freedom of movement of commodities across countries, relatively free movement, free trade. And this means one very important thing. It means that while capital has become global, particularly finance has become global, the states that we still have are nation states. Now, if you have globalized capital confronting nation states, willy-nilly, as long as the country remains within the context of globalized financial flows, the nation state has to do what globalized finance wants it to do. The clearest example is Syriza, because if you do something else, they're going to quit. And if they quit, then you have a financial crisis on your hands. As a result, the writ of finance capital now runs across the globe. And because this rate of finance capital runs across the globe, it has many implications. First, of course, is that state must withdraw from demand management, which is why, as the figures were pointed out by the chairman, we have high levels of unemployment. There may be periods in which crisis and unemployment is kept at bay through the formation of asset price bubbles. The only way that within a neoliberal framework you can actually have a boom is through asset price bubbles or through consumer credit bubbles, but consumer credit bubbles have a very short lifespan because, after all, beyond a point, either the banks won't give any more credit, or alternatively, the workers themselves would not borrow any further to jeopardize their economic position. So, asset price bubbles are the main way in which a boom comes into being in neoliberal capitalism. The 1990s were associated with the dot-com bubble in the United States. The earlier part of this century, the first decade or first few years, were characterized by the housing bubble in the United States. And asset price bubbles in the United States entail that the whole world economy sees a certain revival of demand. But bubbles invariably collapse. When they collapse, you can't put a gun to the head of somebody and say, start a bubble. You can't order a bubble to be started. And even if it gets started again, it will collapse. And as a result, I think as the chairman was saying, now we are on to a period of prolonged, protracted crisis, because the kind of panacea for crisis which post-war capitalism had brought up, namely state intervention in demand management, is something which is no longer possible in a world of globalized finance. John Maynard Keynes was a very clever man. He could see that state intervention in demand management required that finance must be national. So he wrote an article in 1933 in a journal called the Yale Review, in which he actually said, finance above all must be national, because then the state has a degree of freedom to do what it wants within its shores, while if finance is international or globalized, then that autonomy of the state to do what it wants is something which is completely subverted or undermined. The second thing which you find in this period, I'm not even talking about the crisis now, the pre-crisis period, neoliberalism in its heyday. The second thing which you find is, of course, now for the first time in the history of capitalism, you actually have a mobility of capital across the globe. That for the first time, you have American capital locating itself in China, locating itself in Vietnam, locating itself in Indonesia, Malaysia, India, in order to produce for the global market. In other words, there's a shift of activities from the metropolitan countries to some third world countries at least, under the aegis of metropolitan capital. This had never happened before. Whatever capital flows had occurred from the advanced countries to third world countries in the earlier period had been to sectors like plantations, mines, minerals, and so on, primary commodities and trade associated with it, all of which were really integrated with the pattern of colonial division of labor, international division of labor, where these countries were producing primary commodities, manufacturing was in the West. But for the first time, and because if that had not happened, then this dichotomy that you find, where basically India was an underdeveloped country producing primary commodities, while Britain was a developed country producing textiles and other kind of manufactured goods, that dichotomy would have disappeared long ago. The Lancashire textile industry would have moved to Bombay or Ahmedabad long ago. But that did not happen. Now, for the first time, you have a situation where capital is mobile, labor still is not, we are still not allowed to have free mobility of labor from the third to the first world, but we have free mobility of capital from the first to the third world. What this implies is that now the wages of American workers get tied to the labor reserves which exist in third world countries. In fact, that is why Joseph Stiglitz calculates that between 1968 and 2011, the real wage of an American, average real wage of a male American worker has not only not gone up, it has actually slightly gone down. So you have that situation. You may think that those activities moving to third world countries would mean that here labor reserve would get used up and wages would start rising. That does not happen because of the fact that precisely under neoliberalism, a very strong process of expropriation of peasants, petty producers, craftsmen, fishermen, and so on takes place. A process of primitive accumulation of capital occurs, which keeps replenishing the labor reserves. You know that lakhs of peasant households are moved to urban areas in India in quest of employment, but on the other hand, the number of jobs being created is less than the natural rate of workforce growth. So that those moving in quest of employment find that they are excluded from employment. Therefore, there is a swelling of labor reserves, even though there is a movement of activities to third world countries. The swelling of labor reserves makes itself felt not in terms of an employment rationing rule as we normally know it. We think of unemployment 10%, there are 10 fellows unemployed, 90 people employed, and then we say that the reserve army is 10, active army is 90. That's not the case. What typically tends to happen now is that a lot of people are employed 90% of the time, and a lot of people are unemployed for 10% of the time. So the employment rationing takes the form of casual employment, part-time employment, intermittent employment, disguised unemployment, or what is called petty entrepreneurship, which is a form of disguised unemployment. I've told some central minister said the other day that the more people unemployed, the better, because then they'll become entrepreneurs. That entrepreneurship is actually disguised unemployment. But you see, this kind of thing, both the rate increase in the reserve army of labor, or if you like, labor reserves that are flocking to the towns and swelling the labor reserves, then dispossess petty producers, and the specific form of employment rationing also mean that the trade union movement gets weakened. It's weakened everywhere in the world. Two other factors contribute to this weakening of the trade union movement. One, of course, that capital is globalized. If you go on a strike here, then they don't invest here, they invest somewhere else. And secondly, public sector's privatization always affects the trade union movement adversely. Everywhere in the world, public sector enterprises see a more unionized workforce than private sector. In fact, in America, the figure I've seen is that if you include education, then 33% of total public sector employees are unionized, while in the private sector is about 7%. One of the reasons why France continues to have such militant trade union movement, and as you know, Mélenchon at this moment, along with the French unions, is posing a real threat to President Emmanuel Macron, is because France still has a significant public sector. So all these phenomena, privatization, swelling of labor reserves and so on, implies that the trade union movement gets weakened here, and it also gets weakened in the advanced countries because of the fact that capital is now mobile to the third world. For all these reasons, you really find that the challenge of the left, political and economic challenge of the left, tends to weaken precisely at a time when the attack on the workers and the peasants and so on has become particularly intensified. And this is something that we find all over the world. On top of this, when the crisis has intervened, then of course matters have become even more serious. And in this context of the crisis, you find the emergence of a fascist tendency everywhere in the world. Now there is a misconception on the left, to my mind, which actually says that fascism arises only when the working class is strong. That only when capitalism is caught in a crisis and there's a strong workers' challenge, fascism really is used by the capitalists in order to beat down this challenge. I don't agree with this. In fact, Walter Benjamin, the well-known philosopher and critical theorist, had this idea that the emergence of German fascism was associated with the defeat of the German Revolution. That actually it is a defeated revolution which demoralizes, debilitates the working class, which therefore provides an opportunity for petty bourgeois movements of the kind that fascism represented to come up, and which at a certain point then get taken over by the monopoly capital, by finance capital and so on. As you know, they financed Hitler and they continue to finance all kinds of fascists, including our country. They do so in order to push them center stage. They do so in order to ward off any potential challenge, not that there is an actual challenge from the working class, but to consolidate their position. They do so to ward off a potential challenge. Everywhere in the world, fascism is now emerging in a big way. Therefore, the proposition which appeared not in the October Revolution, but which appeared in Rosa Luxemburg's writings, that mankind is faced with a choice between barbarism on the one hand and socialism on the other hand, is a proposition which I think is again become relevant. We live in a historical conjuncture in which mankind is again being faced with a choice between barbarism on the one hand, two alternatives, and socialism on the other hand. Of course, any formulation of a socialist program has to take into account the changes which have taken place in the nature of capitalism. This socialism must not lead to the establishment of a one-party dictatorship, which historical conjuncture at that point of time had really brought the October Revolution to. This socialism has to therefore immediately, as Lenin had visualized, bring about a change where the people politically become masters of their own destiny and thereby lead on to a new situation where they also become masters of their economic destiny by bringing about institutional changes, by transcending the capitalist system. While this is clear, we must not underestimate the difficulties of the current conjuncture as far as the socialist or revolutionary forces are concerned. These difficulties arise from the fact that, as I said, that any country which takes on globalized finance capital, takes on the hegemony of globalized finance capital. If you wish to have any alternative agenda, you have to take on the hegemony of globalized finance capital. Otherwise, you are stuck in neoliberal ethos. I mean, no matter how revolutionary you may be, if you come to power, but of course you are caught in this vortex of financial flows, you would pursue exactly the same policies that any other bourgeois formation, would. So if you want to get out of it, you have to de-link yourself from this process of globalization. This de-linking, of course, I mean, I don't want autarky, but on the other hand, to the extent required, you have to be prepared to de-link yourself. This de-linking necessarily brings in its train transitional difficulties of an extremely high order. You have to be prepared for that. You know, transitional difficulties where, let us take a very simple example. Suppose tomorrow, a left formation captures power in any country, let's say in our country, then immediately, if you wish to do anything, capital would start flowing out. You put capital controls, the moment you put capital controls, you would not be able to finance your balance of payments, balance of trade, you know, your current account deficit. You put trade controls. When you put trade controls, naturally some shortages are going to arise. When shortages are going to arise, then there will be barrage of propaganda. Look at these fellows. Under them there are shortages. Under the previous fascist regime there were no shortages, and so on. There will be enormous efforts to divide the people. There will be enormous economic warfare. In fact, in the era of globalized finance, it seems to me that economic warfare becomes at least as important as military warfare against countries that are trying to break out of the hegemony of finance. Now these are difficulties, but these are difficulties the working class has to be aware of. There's a Hegelian saying that the way to overcome a situation is at least to be aware of it. So I think we have to be aware of it, we have to express, we have to develop the will to overcome it, and only then we have to carry forward the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution, of the October Revolution, as we must if mankind is not to suffer the fate of barbarism. Thank you.
I think now the floor is open for some questions. Yeah, just stand up and ask.
Sir, I have three questions. The one is, so the Lenin actually theory is actually during the First World War, where actually his analysis on imperialism, still it's valid today. And the question, and second question is, see the finance capital, see in the last actually 100 years, see the finance capital character also actually evolved, and they control the entire world. So what is the status actually right now the finance capital? See the Lenin period and for the present situation. And the third question is about actually present economic crisis. So I mean, see the chairman, he presented the data that this mean, the entire world where the economic growth is actually down. And for, other indicators are also actually on the negative side. But for the present, government, they are giving the hope to the people, despite actually.
Here in our country?
Yeah, in our country. Actually, so many data are available where, this economy is actually, the crisis, but still the government is actually again and again actually they are giving the, hope to the people. This crisis in a short time, within a short period will this, come up. So, what is the status of the Indian economy right now?
Thank you very much. I think I'm so grateful to you because you allow me to clarify a point which I should have made. Basically, Lenin's theory of imperialism was examining a phase of imperialism characterized by inter-imperialist rivalry. If you look at the post-Second World War period, in my view, inter-imperialist rivalry recedes to the background. So we have actually gone to a post-Leninist conjuncture, in my view. It recedes to the background immediately after the Second World War because of the unquestioned hegemony of one superpower. Okay, some people have called it a state of super imperialism. But on the other hand, with the coming into being of globalized finance capital, that's the second part of your question, Lenin's finance capital was finance capital based on particular nations. German finance capital, French finance capital, British finance capital. Today we are talking about globalized finance capital or international finance capital, to which all the big bourgeoisies in all countries are really integrated, including the Indian. So the point is that it is against the interests of globalized finance capital to have a partitioning of the world, because partitioning of the world into rival economic territories implies impeding the free flow of globalized finance. Consequently, the reason why today's finance capital, why inter-imperialist rivalry is muted today is precisely because the nature of finance capital is different. Since you're interested in it, I'd just like to mention, some people misread today's situation. You may remember the debate, or not the debate, the kind of dispute between Lenin and Kautsky. Kautsky had talked about ultra-imperialism. And many people, like Giovanni Arrighi and so on, have argued that really speaking, Kautsky was right in that debate. As a matter of fact, what I'm suggesting is that the world has gone beyond both Lenin and Kautsky. Kautsky was talking about internationally united finance capitals. He was also talking about British finance capital, French, German, this, that, and the other, but forming a truce among themselves. While Lenin was talking about the fact that such truces are only temporary, they would be inevitably followed by war. What I'm suggesting is that we have gone beyond this British, French, German finance capitals to a world of globalized finance, which actually would find inter-imperialist rivalry and breaking up of the universe into rival economic territories an impediment to its free movement, to its interests. Your last question is about India. Look, the ruling powers always would naturally like to hold out hope. As far as I'm concerned, I'd like to say that even before this crisis began, there was actually a considerable attack on the living standards, living conditions and rights of the workers and peasants. I've talked about the weakening of the trade union movement, but as a matter of fact, if you look, for instance, at the condition of the peasantry, 300,000 peasants have committed suicide over a 20-year period. Now that is something which tells you the degree to which there is an attack on petty production. I used to be in Kerala in the planning board for 5 years, and we made a study. Fishermen, just look at the fisheries sector. If you look at the fisheries sector, then we said that suppose every fisherman is paid the statutory daily wage, which the state by law has, then the entire sector is in deficit. In other words, the fisheries sector survives because fishermen take a cut in their living standards and accept a standard of living that's well below the statutory minimum wage of the state itself. Everywhere, you just go anywhere, you find that the traditional petty production sector is in a complete crisis. Demonetization and GST and so on have, of course, worsened it, but on the other hand, this crisis was there even before. Now, to the extent this crisis is there and they move to urban areas in search of jobs, as I said, they swell the reserve army of unemployed, which in turn also lowers or restrains the real wage of even organized workers. Okay, so the interests of the peasantry and petty producers and the interests of the working class are really, in that sense, convergent, because a worsening of petty production actually worsens the conditions of the working class. So this was going on even before. With the crisis now spreading to countries like India, it is becoming much worse. I mean, you know, there are plenty of data about the growth in unemployment in the recent period, or the fact that if you look at unemployment now, Labour Bureau study which came out in the EPW recently, you look at enterprises above 10 employees, and you find that in the last 3 years there has been a curtailment of employment in absolute terms by 38 lakhs. So that, the fact that on the one side there is an impoverishment as far as the working people, Lenin defined peasants and workers as the working people. Working people is concerned, and on the other side there is no growth in employment, and all this implies that even the middle class, which was segments of it were beneficiaries of the neoliberal regime, even they are not now getting the kind of benefits. As a result, the whole system has moved into a crisis, and the current manifestation of that crisis at a political level is the fascism that we see emerging in this country.
Two basic major questions. One is that now that IMF and World Bank, they are not using this globalization as a credo now. And at the same time, secondly, the US has now withdrawn from this UNESCO and Paris Convention and other things. Now, how do we see this? Whether it is a dismantling of this international finance capital, what is exactly the contradiction?
I think that's a very important question. IMF and World Bank, they are not as important now, and let's be very, very clear. I mean, IMF was actually a dying institution, as was the World Bank. When the crisis happened, in 2008, shortly after that, there was a G20 meeting. I know about it because there was a meeting in the United Nations and I had to go for that. And there was a president of the UN General Assembly from Nicaragua, Father Brockman. He wanted to actually organize, he said no G20, no G5, G192. He wanted the United Nations to take charge and have a conference and really chart out a new global order. But anyway, shortly after that, there was a G20 meeting. In the G20 meeting, the IMF as an institution was revived with Chinese money, because the Chinese have surpluses, that the Chinese surpluses would now be used by the IMF to come to the aid of countries which have got into crisis and so on. So the IMF really is now a fairly, I'm not saying, I mean, I don't want to overstate the point, but to an extent the IMF and World Bank are moribund institutions. Okay? Your second question is extremely important. In fact, it is what exactly is Trump? Trump wants protections. Protectionism is against the neoliberal order. Okay? And consequently, are we seeing the end of neoliberalism? In one sense, I would argue that neoliberalism is at a dead end. Given the fact that it's at a dead end, how does the ruling class cope with this? Okay, in fact, what I was talking about, the left coming up to cope with it. Now, people like Hillary Clinton don't even recognize it's at a dead end. That's the problem with the liberal bourgeois establishment. They don't even recognize it's at a dead end. They think of it as a temporary thing, we will just disappear. Now, I think Trump's appeal lay in the fact that he at least recognized that there is a crisis. But having recognized that there is a crisis, he had no solution to it. Okay? The typical fascist solution to the crisis is first to project a messiah, okay, 56-inch chest. The second thing they do is to actually talk of the other. There's a crisis because the Mexicans, because the Chinese, because the Asians, so they're always Muslims, so they blame the other. But they really have no concrete solutions to the crisis. Now, what Trump would do is not clear. You see, protectionism, these small things like taxing some companies that invest abroad, even Obama was doing that. If you go for any major protectionism, then you run the risk of creating retaliations from others. And if you have retaliations against American protectionism, then the entire world economy would become even deeper enmeshed in crisis. This is called by economists beggar my neighbor policies, that if you do a spate of beggar my neighbor policies, then the whole world capitalist crisis would become even more accentuated. So I think Trump would be intelligent enough, or rather his advisors, to see that that is not a solution. Some people talk, and he's talking about enlarging the fiscal deficit. Now, but he's talking about enlarging the fiscal deficit in the following way. His enlarging of the fiscal deficit takes the form of tax cuts on the rich. So his idea is that we don't have taxes, corporate taxes go down from 35 to 15% and so on. Tax cuts on the rich do not per se increase demand, because the rich would pocket the tax cuts and that's it. If the tax cuts are even partially offset by cutting down welfare expenditures, in that case, the effect is further recessionary, because on the one side, no expansion in demand, on the other side, contraction of demand. Some people are talking about Trump starting a military, the military expenditure. I think a lot of people are talking about that, that military expenditure as the way to revive the American economy. But the problem with military expenditure is that, if military expenditure or any state expenditure, even infrastructure, can generate additional demand only in two conditions. Either if it is financed by a fiscal deficit, or if it is financed by a tax on capitalists, because that's a tax on savings. If you tax workers to finance military expenditure, workers more or less consume what they get, so that you are reducing 100 rupees of demand here to create 100 rupees of military demand there, so there is no net increase in demand. Now, taxing the capitalists or even running a fiscal deficit to finance larger military program is something that Trump is not talking about. On the other hand, his tax cut program suggests the very opposite. So I really don't think that Trump has any clear answers, okay? And in fact, I think that is a problem with contemporary fascism. Which is good as far as the left is concerned, because in 1931 in Japan, and in 1933 in Germany, when the fascists came to power, they undertook military expenditures in the midst of the Great Depression, and these were the first countries to come out of the Great Depression. Therefore, there is a period between 1933 and, let's say, the war with Poland, during which Hitler's support base actually expanded, because he had got Germany out of the Great Depression, and the kind of horrendous effects of the war still had not struck the country. So there was a period, interregnum. But today, I don't think fascism can actually do that, because in any case, globalized finance would not allow fiscal deficits, and nobody is talking about a fiscal deficit except to the extent that it actually constitutes transfers to the rich. And as a result, I do not see contemporary fascism, whether in India, whether elsewhere, actually being in a position to get the economies out of the crisis, which is a weakness of fascism and which is a potential strength of the left that can challenge the fascists.
So I have three questions.
Let us speak first.
Sir, you talked about the Indian imperialist
Speak a
structure.
bit louder. We don't have one of those things. Sorry.